All right, we can go and get started, and folks will come in as they need to. Just a reminder for anybody who just joined, feel free to put your attendance in the meeting. 1 second. Okay, so just as a reminder, this is the first SLSA tooling meeting. This meeting is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube at some point later. And your participation in this meeting is an agreement to abide by the OpenSSF Code of Conduct. Cool. Okay, so it's the first meeting, so there's going to be a couple of different agenda items here. So I think the first one that actually before getting into this, well, it looks like everybody on this are folks who regularly participate in SLSA, so I don't think we necessarily need to do introductions unless folks do. Do folks want to introduce themselves?
If you don't mind, I'd like to introduce myself. My name's
Sure.
My name's Rob Winch, and I'm actually kind of new to these meetings. I'm from VMware, and I'm the project lead for Spring Security, which is a prominent. Spring is kind of a prominent Java project, and we're here trying to look for ways to take steps to secure our builds. Been kind of following. I'm a colleague of Joshua, who's big into SLSA, and but I'm looking into ways to kind of secure Java builds, which I know there's been steps with Go and some other ones, and I heard recently that there's interest in building better tooling for Java-based builds. So I'm kind of here to kind of second whoever requested support for Java builds, and kind of also see what there is that we can do to kind of help further that along.
Yeah, sounds awesome. Does anybody else want to introduce themselves? I notice a lot of Googlers.
I'll go. I'm Isaac. I'm from Google. Hey, Mike, how's it going? And yeah, I've been coming to the SLSA community and working group meetings for a while. I'm actually super stoked for these new working groups within SLSA, and hoping that we can get some real momentum around some core topics. And I think tools is one that's close to my heart. So yeah, I'm pretty excited to be here.
All right. Wietse Venema, I work with Mark Laudato, and my current activity is policy.
I guess
I'll go next.
since the Googlers are introducing themselves, yeah. Sorry, who is that? I didn't see that.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to introduce myself. This is Parth.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's lagging a little bit, but yeah, I'm with Michael. We are with a startup. We started a startup called Kusari, which is focused on secure supply chain. And we're, I'm interested in figuring out what we can do and how we can provide more tooling that aligns with SLSA, and if there's anything existing, and we can refine stuff, and that better aligns with SLSA and stuff. So I'm glad to be here, and I should be interested to see what comes out of this.
I can go next. Hi, I'm Naveen Srinivasan. I contribute to a few OpenSSF projects. Interested in SLSA, helping with the tooling. Here to contribute with respect to tooling and things like that. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Shripad. I recently joined Intel. I was part of another organization before, and primarily focus on various aspects of supply chain security. So happy to be part of this group.
Cool. Is there anybody else? Otherwise, we can get to the first item on the agenda. Okay. Oh, I guess I haven't introduced myself. So I'm also Mike. I'm also at Kusari, doing a lot of work on the supply chain space. I'm also one of the leads for one of the security leads for the CNCF security tag, the security group over there, and helped sort of lead up the secure software factory reference architecture and contributed to some of the other CNCF supply chain security best practices work. And so, yeah, a lot of my interest is in seeing what we could do to sort of better SLSA tooling, while also sort of seeing how we can integrate that SLSA tooling with other projects and whatnot that are kind of going on there. Okay, so let me, so I think, Isaac, yours probably makes the most sense to start off with. Do you want to?
Yeah, I'm hoping it'll be brief and uncontroversial. I'm just thinking a little bit about the scope of this team. I mean, we've called it tooling, but I think broadly, you know, I've been thinking of it at Charter as slightly more broader around SLSA enablement, and I think tooling is a massive part of that. But I think as well, we should be you know, we should be open to pursuing and generating patterns and examples and documentation, and really thinking that, you know, this is, you know, we're in the business of reducing friction of adopting and using SLSA, and tools is going to be a big part of that. But, you know, especially as we get started as well, we should be open to considering, you know, things that stop short of prepackaged tools, things like, you know, patterns, like, you know, the GitHub Actions Builder began as kind of a, you know, a proof of concept, and I think you know, that was useful even before it became a fully fledged tool of its own right. And so I wanted to just kind of float that idea with the group and see if folks agree, or if there's if there's other ways to be thinking about this. And Mike, since you're the chair, that's kind of in the first instance directed at you.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think it falls somewhere. Whether or not it falls under tooling, I don't know. Just because, you know, I don't think when I look at the other two groups, I don't think that they have that quite yet. I think potentially the adoption group might take some of this long term, but I would be willing to take. Yeah, I would be more than willing to take on some of that initially and then hand off to the adoption group, because the adoption group might not start up for another few weeks, couple of months. And I think that's still really valuable, because actually right before this conversation, there was watching somebody else have an interview about SLSA, and one of the things was it seemed like there's a lot of lack of clarity around how do you get started, and like almost like a getting started guide, or, you know, stuff like you can imagine, you know, hey, if somebody made a handful of YouTube videos or whatever, just to kind of walk through like, oh, this is what it would look like. You have a project, no SLSA. Here's, you know, some of the tools you might be using, and then this is what SLSA looks like throughout that whole journey. I definitely think that is definitely valuable, and I would be, you know, I don't want to speak for everyone, but from my perspective, I'm definitely down to take on that scope initially, with the idea of we should probably just sort of reevaluate once adoption gets started to spun up, because I think once that gets spun up, there'll probably be a little bit of a shift, and you can kind of see there.
No, you're right. I think that's super smart, and I think is exactly the right approach, actually, to consider maybe this our scope a little bit broader in the immediate term. As adoption gets spun up, maybe they'll break off parts of the documentation and patents and so on as part of, you know, creating that easy on-ramp onto SLSA. Yeah, I love that idea. Thank you.
So for me, tools are the enablers that actually make things happen. That's about all I have to say about it now.
Couldn't agree more on that. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. I definitely agree there. I also think the two are also, I think, linked a little bit because without the tools, it's hard to give us getting started guide with salsa because it's like, oh, you can't really actually do it without the tools. But at the same time, once we have the tools, I think it makes sense to say, okay, and here's how you adopt those tools.
Yeah, totally.
So, is there already like a list of salsa tooling that exists out there? Does that need to be the first step, or has that already happened? And do we need to go evaluate that? And then based on those kind of toolings, maybe we can start writing, those blog posts as onboarding things that can help people onboard onto salsa.
So I think so that's going to be the next agenda item is talking about. I think what we're probably going to do is go through this a little bit and then figure out like before we even get to just listing what tools are available today. I think it's probably worthwhile to talk about what categories of tools are available, or are just like what we see as being like the categories of tools that would fall under what we're trying to do, and then we can go and say, okay, are there tools today that do that specifically for salsa? Are there tools that do that, but maybe if they don't have a feature to apply to salsa or whatever? And then are there tools that maybe don't exist that should exist, and so on?
Yeah, I think one thing that might help is there are some groups that they say they achieve salsa 3. Like I was listening to the SUSE, right? They're claiming that they achieve salsa 4, and they have some practices and tooling. So maybe it's good to consider the existing groups or tools or software that they claim they are achieving certain salsa level, and see what they're doing, how they're doing. Maybe that might be a good starting point.
Yep, that makes sense. I do think I think actually that's probably something also worthwhile to identify is like what are the also generic versus specific, right? Like I think the SUSE stuff is obviously very geared towards building SUSE, and it might be valuable to sort of investigate, but maybe for right now, we might want to, reach out to them and just say, hey, are some of those tools you're using to build out salsa, like some of them are probably, a lot of them are probably open source and whatever, but they probably mostly apply to SUSE. Is it something that could be made more generic and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I agree. And I think more than tool, right? It also applies to practices, like how they are doing. They are downloading dependencies before they use it. They are storing it internally. So I think that practice, in what practice they're following, that might also be useful, because I think the salsa, most of them fall under both the tool, actual tools, and some basically practice. Right?
Yeah, that's actually a good point, that it just seems to be maybe more and more as it's being discussed, maybe it just makes more sense. It's like this group is almost more like tooling and practice. It's like this is how you actually do the salsa, right? Salsa specification is talking about the requirements and talking about how to define it in a clear and consistent way. Positioning is then how do we map that to other practices that are being done, other standards and whatever. And then this is the one of like, okay, now how do you actually practically do it? Okay, so actually let me put that down. Does anybody have any thoughts on including should we include practice in this group? Like actually, the practical ways you apply salsa?
Can I ask you?
think so yeah, that was the, I mean, with the, I described it as patterns, but yeah, I think it's a very similar notion. And I think, I mean, to your point, Mike, like we may want to evaluate when the adoption group spins up, and then we need to figure out what the right dividing line is between tools and adoption, given that one is the enabler of the other. But I think ahead of the adoption group getting spun up, it makes sense to think of generally enablement materials, which we can generate, and that would include patterns and practices.
I want to play the devil's advocate. Are we taking too much to be successful? Again, just playing this, I'm just trying to understand. Also, it'll be nice to know, to say what are the other groups that are getting spun up and what are their agenda on a high level, so that it makes it clear for somebody who's not aware what what is that the other groups are going to do.
Sure. Yeah, I can definitely talk to, I think that's also, once again, a good point. We don't want to take on everything. So the other two groups, which I'm also part of, Isaac, I believe you're part of them as well, or at least one of them, I think. So at a high level, the specification group is primarily focused on generating the actual SLSA requirements and clarifying, a couple of things. One is ensuring those requirements are clear and consistent and unambiguous, making sure that they are also they are clear, well, separate from specifically that, but like in addition, it's like they are clear to the outside world, because I think there's been a couple of comments that there's certain things in there that seem to make sense to Googlers, but maybe outside of Google, it doesn't, there's a lot of folks who are like, I don't know what that means. So you have to define it and that kind of thing. So there's definitions and that sort of thing. Also focused on just generally, what is the scope of SLSA as a requirement? Also, they're focused on the specification as far as the metadata, right? So the SLSA attestation predicate format, are there things that need to be added, removed, made clearer in the predicate format as we kind of drive towards 1.0? So that's the specification group. Isaac, do you have anything, or anybody else have anything else to add on there that I might have missed?
No, I think that's a great summary.
And then the other group, which is positioning, is more focused on how do we work with the various open source groups, companies, and so on that are starting to do a lot of this work, or in the supply chain space, and make sure that it's clear where SLSA begins and ends for folks, where we can do mappings between SLSA and other standards like the CNCF best practices guide that talks a lot about supply chain security as well. Like, are there ways that we can kind of say, hey, here's SLSA, here's how you would do it in a cloud native way, because the CNCF has already sort of done that. So that's the focus of positioning, while also talking to some of the, while also trying to identify what groups we should probably have representatives from SLSA join, and then try and get folks from other groups to join here. So this is stuff like there's IETF SCIT, there is a whole bunch of stuff that's happening in the supply chain, general supply chain space. And we just want to make sure that, if we try to really push SLSA as, the really good standard that people should be following, we also want to make sure that we don't step on each other's toes. Because just as an example, the CD Foundation, which is another Linux Foundation group, is starting to spin up supply chain best practices rules for the CD Foundation. And it probably makes sense for, us to kind of work with them on that as well. So that's really at a high level what the positioning group is responsible for. Anybody have any other, like, I don't remember exactly who was on that meeting. So does anybody else have any thoughts around that, or does that make sense? Cool. And then finally, the adoption group, it will be spun up. And the idea was the adoption group would be, how can we make it very easy for folks to get onto SLSA, use SLSA, understand SLSA, get, training, certification, whatever. And the problem with spinning that group up so early is that without the tools, without the specification clarified, without understanding our relationship with all these other groups, it's just going to probably cause a lot of confusion because we'll, be telling people, do this is how you adopt salsa, and then 2 weeks later tell them, actually we decided to change our mind, this is how you adopt salsa, and it will just cause confusion. So those are the other groups. All right. So to get back to Naveen's question, which I think is also very valuable, though, is we don't want to, I agree, we don't want to take on too much. So I think it's probably worthwhile to scope it within the context of the tools that we are spinning up. Like, we shouldn't necessarily talk about too much about the specification, because obviously the specification team is building that out. We probably shouldn't go too deep into this, just my personal opinion, about like, we shouldn't go too deep into stuff like, as an example, like, here's this CNCF tool that does this, that, and the other thing. It should probably be, well, like, I think we should just focus on what makes sense and what folks are super familiar with here. Otherwise, I do think that we're going to end up like pulling in a bunch of different folks. It's going to get complicated, at least until adoption gets spun up. Folks have other thoughts?
Can we, if we agree to this, can we write it down to say, well, up until adoption gets through, so that it's documented?
Yep. So I'm just gonna put mine. I plus one that. I want us to not have to do all that extra stuff once it gets spun up. Does that make sense to other folks? Do other folks have different opinions? Okay, so I saw a thumbs up. All right, cool. Any objections? Okay. We can move on. Cool. So I think, okay, so we have an idea here. So now I think the next step is to maybe get into the categories of what sorts of things from the tools, patterns, practices perspective do we want to start actually working on, and then, or sorry, that we think fall under the stuff that we want to work on in the short term to get us to 1.0. So I had a list here, but obviously I think some of those, based on some of the practices, let me just also, oh, I see we already have actually some of that written up. So build it, verification and decisioning, probably. Categories, tools, and so I see, oh, actually, I realize I haven't been sharing the notes here. Probably makes sense for me to share the notes while we go through, so I can point to them. Okay. Okay, so the distribution, verification, and decisioning. So training and best practices, and then I I think that there's probably, this is. So let's go through the categories and maybe we can talk through and tweak them as we need to. And then after that, we can kind of go through what tools today exist in each of these categories. Does that make sense for folks?
Yeah, one thing that might help is if we can map this to salsa levels, like build and production. It maps to certain salsa level. Or I think that categorization might also help, or just the annotations, not but just whenever
Yep.
we discuss.
Yeah, let me write that up as
Right.
I think
I have another
or requirement.
Yeah.
Label. Actually, labeled.
But yeah, and another one is Salsa also has things to say about source control. We need to mention it somewhere.
Yep. So let's put in, maybe put that in somewhere here on this category. The tooling involved, or I'll just put other tooling. And so this could be scorecard. This could be source code control.
Yeah, just so we don't miss it.
Yep. Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. So do these categories make sense? So the first category is like build and production, which I believe is just like, build tools. So whether it's all the Salsa GitHub Actions work that's in the Salsa frame, in the Salsa, under the Salsa org, or other tools under OpenSSF like Fresca or GitLab or GitHub Actions that are starting to support Salsa probably falls under here. Let me just run this through real quick. Distribution and discovery. Yeah. Okay. This was regarding actually, yeah, pushing out Salsa attestations for other folks to consume. Yeah, so there's that. Verification and decisioning, which is, I think, stuff that falls under that would be things like making sure if you're generating salsa provenance, is it valid salsa provenance? Also, in addition to that, are you verifying the keys are you verifying that it's signed with the right identities? And are you doing policy decisions to ensure, whatever, like admission control, that kind of thing. Training and best practices, that's kind of what Isaac was talking about. And then the other tooling involved, which these are things I think that are not quite Salsa specific, but probably still going to be involved in some of what we do. So this is stuff like scorecard, and some of the stuff that's kind of going on with scorecard is, could you use scorecard to identify elements of your Git repository and whether or not it's applying certain Salsa best practices around your Git repository, that kind of thing. Security insights, that kind of, all those projects that are getting spun up. And then, specifically source code control, because there are requirements around source code control, around two-person code review. Some of that might change as time goes on, but cool. Do those categories make sense? Do folks think something is missing? Do folks think that one of the categories should be merged into another one?
I think, again, my opinion, the distribution discovery is correct, but verification and decisioning, can that be part of? Because if I'm discovering something, am I not doing verification? Again, just doing that app. Or is this a separate tool all by itself to say, you know what, somebody's going to identify where it is, but another tool is going to verify whether it is what it is? Because I'm thinking hypothetically, usually like I'm using something like Sigstore to make sure all my artifacts are in one place and use it in and using that as a place to store, usually verification happens, but need not be. It can be other place also, but just trying to say, is there too many categories coming out?
I think that's a good example, actually, that I think actually SigStore fits squarely under distribution and discovery, but SigStore is not doing salsa verification itself, and it's not doing policy or decisioning. And so that's to me why it makes sense to separate these out. That looking at SigStore as a tool set, it's not, SigStore doesn't do anything around build and production. It doesn't do anything around verification and decisioning, but it could form part of the solution that we need for distribution and discovery, for example. And that's why I think it makes sense to have these as separate.
Makes sense. Agree.
Yeah, so I think maybe we and I'm not very good with words, so I don't know how to maybe reword this a little bit, where it sounds like distribution and discovery, it's also what SigStore does do is SigStore does verify against identity, right? It verifies that you've signed, that you have signed it with a specific key, and that's good. And I think there still is some overlap, but I think what Isaac said is a good way to sort of split it up, where one is it's focused around stuff like verification of identity, making sure like the SigStore stuff is also, you store attestations in Recore, and once some of the bugs are fixed in Recore, you'll be able to verify the signatures in Recore. But the thing there, right, is that kind of makes sense from a purely identity perspective, but SigStore, outside of just verifying, and outside of their whatchamacallit, they have their own emission controller webhook thing now, but I think those two things are kind of somewhat separate, right? Because you that would be a little bit separate than if you look at something like Keyverno or OPA Gatekeeper, which is probably also doing both things, right? You're both verifying that the identity is correct, it's been signed with the right secrets, and so on. And in addition to that, you're actually looking at the metadata inside of the salsa attestation to then say, was this using an approved builder? Was this, using, do I trust the other elements that are kind of happening in there? So I don't know how we want to reword this to make sure that that distinction is clearer.
Yeah, for me, verification decisioning is also, is this the right program, the right binary? Is it built from the right source?
Yep. So do we want to put something in the first topic then to make it clear it's about
yeah, the first one is more about transporting the information securely, the metadata. The second one is about the semantics. What does it actually mean?
Yeah, I think that distribution and discovery is going to be about like, how do you store the metadata once it's created? So like, you'll have definitely things like different language ecosystems, different tools will have different ways of distributing stuff. So like the way that you distribute a Java package, for instance, is different from the way you distribute a Python package. And so you're likely going to need to have different distribution mechanisms for salsa in those cases, because you'll want it to be close to the package, and ideally be consumed using the same tools or the same set of tools.
Yeah, whereas decisioning is more about the semantics of the metadata.
Yeah, definitely. So like, usually I would say like, the word that I usually use is policy, but like decisioning is the same sort of thing. Yeah, so it's like, verifying the identity of the person, of the whatever created, of the builder, I guess, that created the provenance, and verifying that the provenance has the type of, or has the types of values in it that you expect or that you want.
To build on that, you also want to be able to have some sort of mapping between the way that people are used to consuming the artifacts and the metadata, because right now it maps a lot to the GitHub repository, but our users in the Java space, they don't really know much about the GitHub repository when they're consuming the artifacts. They just have like a coordinate for the binary. And so like there needs to be some sort of mapping between how they consume it with the binary name and version to the SLSA stuff so they can actually compare that stuff.
Yeah, I think that's pretty similar to like other languages, like Python. When you use Python packages, you don't really usually aren't really aware of the GitHub repository it's built from. Or, and I would say the same with Ruby packages, for example.
It's more about purpose.
Yeah.
Yep. So maybe if we go the other way around, because I'd be curious here, like based on some of this, right? The verification and decisioning, distribution and discovery. It sounds like something like SigStore might fall under both of those categories at some level. Right, where so distribution and discovery, right? You know, actually there's a separate thing here, which is just like actually the generation and signing of SLSA provenance. I don't, you know, I think it probably falls under one of these categories as we're kind of building that out. But SigStore does that piece, right? It stores stuff in Recore. It also using cosign and similar tools, you can store stuff inside the OCI registry. Given some of the work that's being done, you know, across the board, there's discussions about could you inject this into a Python package using something like SigStore and that kind of thing, or at least have it somewhere live alongside it. And then separately, when consuming that, you can still use SigStore tools to do the initial like, hey, was this Python package signed by the maintainer of the Python package, or is it different? So, are folks comfortable with it falling like with potentially tools falling under multiple categories?
I think that's fine.
I think it's perfectly fine.
Yeah, I mean, you could imagine kind of laying these categories out in some kind of columnar view, and then having, you know, literally like visually mapping tools onto it and saying, you know, this tool set here spans these two categories here, or actually this tool set here covers the entire life cycle and then helps you, you know, through from build and production all the way through decisioning on the policy side. So
yeah, I would imagine that a lot of tools. Yeah, I was going to say, like, I would imagine a lot of tools will do discovery and verification decisioning. So, like, you'd be able to discover the SLSA for a particular package and then verify that SLSA, you know, like, so I would imagine a lot of tools would do both, but, like, you know, there's going to be two sides of that. How do you discover the package and how do you actually, like, kind of distribute it?
And I think that's right. And it could be as well that some of these things may not be net new tools that we need to build, that it may be that we need to go and talk to package managers and say, hey, package managers, you know, we've got these problems around, you know, verification and discovery, let's say, or distribution of SLSA provenance, and we may need, you know, Maven or PyPy or whatever to, you know, be a part of this and help us build parts of the solutions for particular language ecosystems. I mean, and so I guess that the categories stand out to me as kind of these are necessary. We're going to need we're going to need solutions which span all of these end to end to have a successful SLSA end to end. And it could be that for some language ecosystems, these are standalone tools. For some, it may be that we need to work with package manager. For some, we may need to work with existing build systems rather than you know, building that new ones and so on.
That's exactly right, I think.
Cool. So I think that seems fairly reasonable. So do we now want to kind of start going through and identifying current tools that exist today that are trying to at least solve this problem or in some way involved in solving this problem? And like I created a little thing here under current tooling and gaps. And so we can also identify if like there are certain things like, you know, oh, there's no tool that seems to hit this specific thing for salsa, and we can kind of call that out. Does that make sense to folks?
Yep.
There's going to be a lot of gaps.
Yes, yes. So feel free to start putting stuff in here because you know, there's going to be a whole lot probably to put in there. You know, I'm going to put in obviously some of the tools that I am familiar with or I'm working with. Oops.
Michael, could you say a few words about Fresca? I kind of I see this coming up again and again, and I'm in the channel, but I'm vaguely following along, but I'm not quite sure what it's about. Could you contextualize it a little bit?
Sure. So Fresca, the history of Fresca is while Salsa was starting to come up and while the CNCF was building out their secure software factory, when a few of us were over at City, we were building an implementation of that using a bunch of open source tools underneath the Linux Foundation, stuff like Tecton chains, trying to tie it all together such that we could follow all the best practices, right? And it like by default and constrain, you know, so right, you can run Tecton without actually following Salsa, but we wanted to sort of say, hey, here is, if you deploy this, it is configured in such a way that you have Spiffy Spire, so you're getting short-lived workload identities, helping hit the non-falsifiable requirement. You know, and all of these different things. And so really it's a collection of tools and abstractions on top of those tools intended to sort of be, you know, like a lot of the GitHub action stuff is great, but a lot of people can't always use GitHub Actions or use GitLab and whatever. They need to say, hey, we need to run this on-prem or whatever, and they need to use some other tool. And so the idea behind Fresca is kind of being that sort of thing.
Got it. So I could kind of think of it as almost like a reference architecture, but with an instantiation of that using open source tooling.
Yeah, so it's like it's an implementation of the reference architecture.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a better way of saying it. Thank you. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. And yeah, so it's open source, and it falls also under the OpenSSF supply chain integrity working group. So it is a sister project to Salsa in that context.
I'm going to ask a question on that. Again, it's not, I don't know whether, does it make sense to bring that into this tooling working group? Because now we have a specific stuff that is people, resources being spent on this. Having diversified is great, but then with that comes distribution of resources, which might be hard to keep up. I'm just trying to ask. This is not the forum to ask that question, but just throwing that out.
Yeah, I mean, I think for at least initially, the scope of this group is more around also just sort of, I think we first need to identify what already exists, what's out there. And then we can kind of go back and say, oh, great. Like, does it make sense for folks in this group to start partnering with SigStore to get some of this stuff out? Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe SigStore already is doing the right things and we don't necessarily need to do that. Same thing with any of the stuff here like Tecton or Keyverno, OPA Gatekeeper, and so on. I think the first step though is just to identify what exists today that is trying to sort of solve the problem. And then we can kind of go back and determine like what makes sense for like literally hands-on keyboard are folks to work on. But I think that's a good point, right? Like there's only so many people, so many, you know.
That's good. Thanks.
So Ian, I know you have a bunch of little tools underneath the Salsa actual org. You and Laurent and others. Do you want to add some of those? Oh, yep, there we go. Salsa GitHub generator, and yeah.
Yes, so the generator, we also have the verifier, which I'll add in the verification section here. Kind of curious, like how much OPA tooling there actually is that actually supports Salsa.
Yeah, it is a good point. I saw a couple of folks write up some examples. And I've actually written up some examples in the past as far as, but we could also identify that as, because I do think, for example, Kyverno has like native support for Salsa provenance.
Yeah, I think Opa Gatekeeper, you have to be more create your own policy to do your checking. Basically, I don't think it currently exists.
Yeah, I saw a few folks writing up some libraries for it, but let me just actually, if I do Opa.
Yeah, I mean, like you could theoretically, like you could have a Rego policy that you create using OPA or whatever, but I don't know that there's any like OPA libraries or like anything that's like that I've seen that like actually supports Salsa in a meaningful way. I guess like verifying the signature and things like that. I think, yeah, basically like what Kyverno is doing.
So maybe we just identify that as, because I do think it is, remember the other thing I think we probably want to do while sort of figuring this out is, for example, yeah, if Open Gatekeeper has multiple gaps in doing this, we might just want to open up, like, not focus our time, but just open up an issue on OPA's, GitHub, just say, hey, there's a lack of some, tooling that makes this sort of thing easy, and then just sort of leave it at that. And does that make sense?
Yeah, I think like identifying tools that should have support but don't is a good thing for us to do.
Cool.
Also, going back to Shripod's recommendation, do we want to label like what Salsa level these tools are at, and like parentheses or something, or currently?
Yeah, I think it's probably worthwhile under the like tabbed in. It probably makes sense to also talk about specifically if it hits a specific Salsa level. In certain cases that is irrelevant or it doesn't really make sense. But I think also some of the stuff in there that's probably valuable is like as we go through, for example, the other tooling, right? There's going to be stuff here of, GitHub's 2-person pull request, right, is going to satisfies this specific, requirement. It itself is not, Salsa 3 or whatever. It's just that it hits this specific requirement for Salsa 3.
Mm-hmm.
I know that that GitLab has a bunch of documentation on this where they recently how they have done Salsa compliance. 1 second. Yeah, so GitLab has written some stuff on it. Distribution and discovery. So I will also, I'll highlight something that a few of us over at Google and, oh, sorry, well, I'm not at Google, but a few folks at Google plus Santiago from Purdue and a few of us from Kusari are working on a tool called AFF, which we are building out some proof of concepts for. And I will bring up the document for it, but it's a distribution mechanism of, let me double check here. Is this the right doc that we have? No, that's not the right one.
You want me to link the document, Mike?
Yes, I can't seem to find the right link here.
Yep.
Yeah, but the idea behind AFF would be a way to take stuff like SLSA, other associated supply chain metadata, transform it into a graph that you can then run queries against for stuff like decisioning eventually and whatnot. But the big idea there, right, being if I have a SLSA attestation and my dependencies have SLSA attestations up to some level, then I can essentially build a graph out of those SLSA attestations and be able to ask more ask interesting, deeper questions about stuff like, do I have transitive SLSA and that kind of thing. Okay. Is anyone familiar if GitHub has the default builder support now for SLSA, or is it mostly just the work that that some of you over at Google have done?
I'm not aware of any like native GitHub support.
I'll also just sort of, yeah, it looks like it's the, yep. Okay, cool. And I'll just, in that case, also just add a link here under the GitHub generator. There's a SLSA, just a blog also coming out of GitHub, just to show that at least they are, it's not just like, you know, GitHub is also interested in this. Okay, so we only have 3 minutes left. I think obviously offline folks can kind of add in additional set up folks can put in obviously additional tools in here. Also, as we kind of go through, please, if you identify like, oh, there really appear to be no tools that do X, feel free to put it in here and identify that is like a gap. Because I do think, for example, from the distribution and discovery perspective, there does seem to be a lack of tooling. I know that some folks, for example, from the distribution discovery, you know, they just store attestations, assigned attestations in OCI. Like they do that. Oh, right. Yeah. Google Cloud Build. Yeah. So feel free to just add more stuff in there over the next week. And then probably, does it make sense for next week? Then we kind of go in and start to do just sort of a generic like analysis of, okay, where are the big gaps? What needs to start getting addressed sooner rather than later? And then identify where we actually want to throw our support behind.
Sounds great. Thank you, Mike.
Cool. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
I think this is a great start.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'll see you all in Slack, and have a good weekend.
Yeah.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks for running this. Cheers.
Yeah. Thank